Thank you for joining us this afternoon here at KEDC. You know, it's always exciting to work with our co-op and work with our colleagues out in the school districts. As we are working on our education and equity series, we are truly honored this afternoon to welcome to our panel Mr. Eric Kennedy, who is the Director of Advocacy with KSBA. So Eric, at this time, I just turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for kind of at an odd time, 1 o'clock Eastern, I guess right at noon Central across Kentucky. Thank you for coming on to this session today. I love this series that KEDC is doing about various ways that equity comes up in education, especially at the K-12 level in Kentucky. I think for all of us, for anyone on this webinar today, anyone in public education, we know that the word equity has kind of taken on a new life recently. A lot of folks have different ideas of what it means. A lot of folks think that it's something new and possibly even sort of a code word for something else. But really, of course, we know it's not. The concept of equity, what it means and how it is important in public education has been something we've talked about forever, for the history of public education. As a matter of fact, getting ready for this program today, yesterday I pulled up the debates of our state constitutional convention in the 1890s, and the word equity is even used there when they were discussing what became the provisions of our state constitution, setting up our public education system that long ago. So it is not new, but it's very important for us to be talking about equity, especially because of the way that it's come into the public debate recently. So on this topic today, as Andy said, I'm Eric Kennedy. I'm the Director of Advocacy for KSBA, the Kentucky School Boards Association, but I'm just speaking today only in my personal capacity as just one person, not representing anyone other than myself. And I'm also, of course, not representing officially KSBA as an entity, as an association. And for this topic, I know in other months you've talked about other groups of students or other groups of people. Of course, today we're going to talk about LGBTQIA students primarily. I know what a lot of you might be thinking whenever this topic comes up or whenever we see those acronyms come up in education, but I want to tell you this will be a very sort of comfortable, informal discussion. I'm going to share a little bit of my own human story, very little. It's not going to be a long biography of my own personal story. And then I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the legal aspects of equity for these students, in particular, students who identify as any one of these groups in that acronym, and what equity looks like for them in our public schools, some of the legal developments that have happened recently, some things that come up in my work, working for superintendents and school board members in districts across Kentucky at KSBA. So we'll just get right into it. First, I will say I'm grateful to be invited to talk about this topic today, but I actually don't talk about this a lot. I can probably count on one hand the number of times in my life I've actually said to someone, I am gay. I don't really talk about it specifically that much. I don't talk about my family that much any more or differently than most people talk about their families. I am married, born and raised in Kentucky. I've lived here all my life. My husband and I have adopted a daughter who was first in our home as a foster daughter. We have now adopted her to be a permanent part of our family. But I talk about that about as much and in the same way as any of you probably talk about your spouse or your family or children. When it comes up because it's sort of my normal life. So I actually, as I said, probably fewer than 5 times have I ever actually sort of said, you know, I am gay and talked about that specifically. So this is even a little bit new for me. So I share, some of you that may be watching this or may watch it after it's recorded may kind of think, well, you know, here we go again. It's going to be, you know, I've heard a story like this or I heard a presentation like this before, but really I've never, it's as new to me as it is to you all. I've never really presented it like this before. But as I said, a lot of this seems new, but isn't. I know for some folks, you may think that you can't keep up with the acronym. Every time you see something about this topic comes up, there's a new letter in the acronym. Some folks think they can't keep up with it or they don't know what it all means. I definitely get that, but parts of kind of a few anecdotes from my own personal story I'll share. It is important to remember that this is not new. Having students that identify in any of these ways in our schools is certainly not new. talking about them and kind of what equity looks like for them in one way or the other also is not new. It seems like at the real public national level, we are talking about it a little bit more maybe than we used to, with sort of official statements and resources and guides coming out about this specific group of students. Perhaps some of that is more than what we used to see, but this has been a part of our discussion in public education for many, many years. And so sometimes when this comes up, either our gut reaction is that, well, here we go again, this seems like all we're talking about lately, or a new legal development or a new piece of guidance comes out, or there's a new Supreme Court opinion that comes out and people start talking about how it will change things. I think it's very important to always slow down and take a step back and don't jump immediately into the weeds on some topic. And remember that this is not new. These students are not new to our schools. Meeting their needs and needing to talk about what their needs are is not new. And in fact, some of the sort of the legal aspects that I'll talk about in a few minutes even really are not changed or new, or are not different for these students compared to other students that we have. So we'll go through some of that, always remembering that our responsibility to each and every child is very much the same. Sort of educating and meeting the needs of each and every child in Kentucky is the mission of our Kentucky public schools, and every employee, every volunteer, everyone from local school board members up to state legislators, every stakeholder involved, we all share that same mission. And that mission is timeless and is not at all new. And so as we back up a little bit out of jumping straight to the weeds that we often do, a few weeks ago when we got together to plan this session, a couple of us kind of joked that usually when this topic comes up, one of the very first things that immediately comes up from someone in the audience is some question about designing a bathroom in a school or who can use which bathroom. We are going to jump way back from those sorts of in the weeds topics and talk a little bit more broadly. And the key thing above all, there's kind of two big overarching things that I'm going to talk about, is just awareness and mindfulness. Being aware of these students and the fact that we have them in all of our classrooms and all of our districts everywhere, and just being mindful of that is kind of the key overarching theme, whether we're talking about an individual story, a personal story of one student or another, or we're talking about sort of a national legal development or a change in the law that makes us do something in a certain way. The key thing is always just being aware of that and being mindful in guiding everything that we do. So first, kind of a little bit of the human story on this. I will say again, I am a lifelong Kentuckian, born and raised here as far back as I know in any kind of genealogy that anyone in my family has done. My family came into Kentucky about immediately after it began being settled after the Revolutionary War. My family and I have never lived anywhere else. I say that because sometimes also when this topic comes up in an education discussion among educators, sometimes folks have sort of said either to me or in discussions like this that have happened, some folks out there sometimes think that, well, this really doesn't come up that often in my school or my district, or, no one ever really brings this up unless it's some state level group or some national group that brings it up, or otherwise it doesn't really come up that often. Sometimes there might be a feeling of, well, this only really comes up in some other state or in a big city someplace. And all of the news articles we see, it's always something happening someplace else, and it really doesn't happen here or come up here. So I wanted to share with you that, I, a lifelong Kentuckian, am here kind of to share my story that, yes, it does come up here. Yes, we have these students in all of our classrooms. And when I was starting to think of how I would really describe that, there is one little personal story that I will share with you that I've very rarely shared with anyone. It goes back to the year 1995. I was about 12 years old in the summer of 1995. I was living in Paducah, raised over in Paducah, Kentucky, product of the public schools from Head Start all the way up to law school in Kentucky public schools. So when I was about 12 years old, I was about in the 6th grade when the movie Braveheart came out. And I remember as a 12-year-old, who for any of us, 12 years old is sort of the beginning of what for many of us is a very transformational time in our personal development. I already at that age knew that I was in some ways felt a little bit different than some of the other kids, some of my friends and some of my other classmates. Didn't quite know yet exactly how or what that meant, but definitely already had some of that awareness myself. And yet in 1995, didn't have a lot of openly gay people in my immediate sort of circle. I had one or two relatives that sort of had come out or were openly gay. That was not always met well with other relatives in the family. But the movie Braveheart came out. And I remember vividly sitting in my living room with me and my mom watching on TV the movie Braveheart. And if you remember that movie at all, I can't believe it's been that many years now. If you remember that movie with Mel Gibson, 1995, watching that movie, there is a character that's sort of the crown prince. He is going to eventually inherit his dad as the king of England. He is going to probably one day inherit that and become king himself. There is a scene where the prince and his father, the king, are sort of talking to each other in the castle. And I'm watching that movie with my mom there in the living room. And the prince brings in this sort of friend of his. And it's very clear almost immediately that what they're trying to say is that the prince is gay and this is sort of his boyfriend that he's brought in to sort of be this special advisor to him there in the castle. And he's introducing him to the king, and it's clear that without saying those words, it's kind of clear that that's what's happening in the story. Well, I knew that that story was set, number one, it was based on a real life story. And when that real life story happened, these characters were real people in history, was around the year 1300. And so I remember turning to my mom and sort of being confused. And I said, wait, there were gay people back then? And my mom, without planning a big response, just immediately said, well, yeah, there have been gay people as long as there have been people. Hearing that from my mom when I was 12 years old, already feeling that I was in some way different than some of my friends, but not having really worked that out yet, that was so kind of shocking to me as a realization, not only in its simplicity and how simple and quick she nailed that out, but also the fact that even though it seems ridiculous now, especially myself, eventually sort of kind of realizing and accepting who I was, that at that point in 1995, a kid growing up in Paducah, for some reason, I had this notion that gay people was a new thing that someone had just come up with. And we had just recently been talking about it, it was like a new thing in the 90s or something. Even I myself felt that way. And I think a lot of people maybe did then, a lot of people around maybe sometimes still feel that way. And yet my mom was absolutely correct. As long as there have been people all throughout history, everywhere in the world, there have been people that identified in some of the terms and labels that we now use, like the acronym LGBTQ. They have been a part of every society all across the world. Everywhere that there have been people, there have been gay and lesbian people, transgendered people, and so forth. And so why that is important for us, speaking to an audience of educators in Kentucky, it is so important that everyone, as I said, is aware and mindful that you have students right now in every school who identify publicly or not in one of these groups. You had classmates when you were growing up in school who identified publicly or not, openly to you or not, in one of these ways. You have colleagues who do in every district, in every community in Kentucky, from Paducah to Pikeville. And an example of that also comes out from my own life is that I went to law school up in Northern Kentucky at Chase College of Law. This would have been probably around 2008. A classmate of mine in college, in law school at one point, told me and said, you're the first person I've ever known that was gay. And I said immediately, I promise you I'm not. Maybe no one told you that. Maybe you didn't have this direct conversation about it. But I promise you, this other person who grew up, born and raised in Kentucky and was, out of college at that point, said, I promise you I'm not the first person that you have known that was gay. But even as late as that person thinking that and not being aware is why it's so important to have these conversations about who these folks are, who they are in our classrooms, who these students are, and kind of making sure that we're meeting their needs and providing equity for them so that they ultimately can have access to the education service and offerings that is their right. And so, another key part of this human story is that at all times, as I said, including now, even with the changing discussions that we have and changing attitudes about this, even with a greater general public acceptance and public openness of folks that identify in any of these groups living openly all across America, even with that, it's important to remember that every individual person is unique. As I said, all of you have students in every district and every school who identify or one day will identify in one of these groups of folks. Some may not. Some may not openly do that right now. Some may at different ages. Some of your students may sort of come out and identify in one of these ways or not. Some may struggle, some may not. It will look different for every person. And all of that is for each person to work out if and when and how they want to work it out. And so even as we sit here and talk about this and talk about it perhaps more publicly and openly than we used to, it's also important not to jump all the way to the point of what do I as a teacher need to do if a student comes out to me or not, or if I think maybe for some reason I think that maybe they are in one of these groups, but they haven't talked about that to me or brought it up or said anything. Should I bring it up to them or not? All of that is jumping to a place that really, in most cases, we do not need to jump to and kind of proactively do some of that. And yet we are still able to provide equity to all students. Now, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I think the key thing is, and this goes back also to my story of growing up in public schools in Kentucky, having that conversation, that realization from watching the movie Braveheart that, gay people is not some new thing that just came about in the 90s. Having that realization even for myself, and then going through high school, going through college, coming to a place where then I had friends that openly sort of came out and identified this way. I eventually at a certain point did, to members of my family and to friends and to colleagues at work and classmates. Just being mindful and aware of the students that you may have, but don't necessarily think there's something specific you need to push or bring up to any of them is kind of the key thing, in my personal opinion, just speaking only for myself, that is the real foundation of the discussion of equity for these students. Personally, even though this was for me 20 or 25 years ago, when I was growing up, around the time that I had that realization with my mom watching Braveheart, I would have probably wanted to crawl into the floor and disappear if any of my teachers had sort of proactively brought this up to me in some way or asked me about it. Everyone is different. For me, my unique experience with that was very much that at that age, at that point in time, 20 or 25 years ago, I actually did not want to talk about it, wasn't ready to talk about it, and would not have wanted to talk about it if someone at school kind of proactively brought it up. But that also included, frankly, classmates at the time. Anytime that a classmate sort of brought it up, not necessarily in a bullying way, but just brought it up at all, kind of asked me, Eric, are you gay? Anytime like that happened, just for me personally, at that point in time, I just did not want that discussion to be happening. And that is where I think the adults in the building, the educators, teachers, and other folks, the awareness that they had at the time, or that the awareness level that they should have had of kind of watching out for the needs of students who may possibly be LGBTQ, to kind of check in there and kind of make sure that's okay. And if it's not okay, if it might be, bullying or something, just some kind of unwanted discussion, stepping in to steer that in a good direction is kind of a piece of what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes that weighs in on what equity looks like for these students. It always has to begin, as I said, with the awareness that every classroom, every school has students in one of these groups, whether you know it or not, whether you're like my friend from law school who thought she had never met a gay person or not. Being aware that these folks are everywhere, always have been, is so critically important. Being aware that this is not some new thing that we kind of have to follow some checklist about. Just that general awareness is so key. That is just step one in equity for these students. A colleague of mine here in this line of work that kind of brought this up to me in a very interesting way. She said that she had explained to her own children when she was raising her kids, and now she is at the age that she has grandkids. She said, in all of my work in education, I always simply said whenever something like this came up, not only for LGBTQ students, or whenever that topic came up in a classroom, or any other sort of group of students that in any way was different, any other kind of minority group. She always simply said to the folks she was working with, the students that she had, that all families are different. And she said, kind of like what my mom's response was to that movie, she said, when you really keep it simple and just straightforward and accurate, that almost always resolves the discussion. She said whether ever or not it was, a student in class that was being raised by one grandmother. She would say, well, some kids, their family is just one grandmother. Goodness knows in Kentucky, we have a lot of those families. Whether it was a single mom, whether it was a family where the student, they went home and had two moms or two dads, or a student who went home to foster parents. Whenever anything came up like this, just sort of addressing it that way and saying all families are different and there are all sorts of families. That is just sort of a short, simple, accurate statement that we can carry over in other months, other episodes of this webinar series that you're doing on equity. Isn't that kind of a fundamental truth and a fundamental way to address all of the unique students we have in all of our public classrooms, to simply say that all families are different and there are all sorts of families everywhere? That came up for me personally. I was at one point several years ago when my daughter was probably about 3 years old. I was always the one in our house that usually picked her up from daycare. So all the other kids in the 3-year-old daycare classroom were used to seeing me at the end of the day coming to pick up my daughter. I almost kind of got to be friendly with them, as you can imagine, as I'm sure many of you have had it happen to you. One day, for some reason, I think we were going immediately to a doctor's visit. Myself and my husband came to pick her up from daycare. So we both walked into the lobby and she's kind of getting her stuff together. And one of the other little boys in the room, and probably another 3-year-old boy, looked up at me. He knew me and recognized me, looked over to my husband and said, "Who's he?" And I, there again, keeping it simple of just, you don't have to launch in necessarily to a big discussion, especially depending on the age of the person you're talking to. I simply kept it simple, said, "Oh, well, that's her other dad. She has 2 dads." And this little kid said, "2 dads? What the heck?" And after the staff, the teachers in that room, after everybody stopped chuckling at how cute that was that this little boy said it that way, simply that was it. Said, well, all kids have all sorts of families. She has 2 dads. That was the end of it. Not only for everyone there, for him, for my daughter, it really was basically kind of that simple. So turning now to more discussion of, okay, accepting that every public school has students of all ages that are LGBTQ, accepting that, realizing that, having a greater awareness. So then what is the next step? Getting past the point of thinking, well, this doesn't come up for us in our school, or maybe no one sort of has brought this up, no student has come and announced this or said that, kind of come out and said, well, I identify in this way. Assuming that you have students who just haven't brought that up to you, but they are in your school. So what does equity look like for them? There are about 5 big topics that I want to kind of briefly discuss, and then I think we'll have time for Q&A in the chat box if there is any. This is always the point where folks will usually jump straight to one or another of these kind of 5 big areas of what your response in public education should be. What does the law say? What do we have to do or not do when this comes up for you? And it will, because we all have these students. The first thing is always at the federal level. The first of these 5 topics I want to briefly touch on in sort of the legal information providing out to you is from the Office of Civil Rights at the United States Department of Education. The acronym, of course, is OCR. Many of us, probably most of us, are familiar with that agency, that part of the U.S. Education Department. Unfortunately, sometimes it kind of gets the immediate gut reaction for some school folks is one of apprehension when they see or hear OCR brought up, because unfortunately, sometimes the main way that school districts across America and school district leaders interact with them directly is when they are doing an investigation and there's been some sort of formal complaint filed with them by a student or a parent or a family in some way. But that is the one part of the United States Department of Education that really deals with a lot of issues of legal equity for all sorts of different students, including LGBTQ students. There is a resources page on their website that I think we can provide the link to you later that is devoted to the law around students that identify in any of these groups of people, what the state of the law is. It is evolving. Every once in a while, there is a lawsuit or a court case somewhere in America in some federal court across the country that works its way up, and a court may or may not change its interpretation of what the law requires for equity for these kids. To the extent that that is evolving, the most up-to-date information is usually there on this website with the OCR. One development recently that has come about that I do want to touch on specifically is with Title IX. Title IX, as we all are familiar, is the kind of the fundamental, the main federal law about fairness and equity and civil rights for students in America's public schools. Usually it comes up with athletics and making sure that there is fairness and equality between athletics and what is provided by school districts for boys and for girls. That is the most common thing that you've probably usually heard when someone just says Title IX. It's usually about a complaint that the district is in some way doing something more or less or providing more or less in terms of athletics for a girls' team or a boys' sports team. But it is actually much bigger and broader than that. Title IX basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. That is the phrase in that federal law. There was a court case a couple of years ago now that went up through the court system at the federal level, and our United States Supreme Court issued an opinion in the Bostock case that basically said, now for purposes of Title IX on the basis of sex, that phrase and that word sex, that is broad enough to encompass someone's sexual orientation and someone's identity and status as a transgendered person, someone who identifies in that way. So that interpretation by the US Supreme Court of that federal law was, as I said, this is somewhat evolving in the law. That was a big, not necessarily a shift in what we do. The law generally in most cases was applied that way already by the US Department of Ed, but it did very clearly make that interpretation, kind of removed any doubt and said, that is what this word means, that encompasses any discrimination on the basis of sex would mean on the basis of someone's sexual orientation or on the basis also of someone's identity, their gender identity, and if they identify as a transgendered person. So over the last couple of years, a lot of guidance has come out from the federal government agencies. I know KSBA has put out a lot of guidance to district leaders about what that really means in the operations of our school districts. And so that was one example of kind of a new evolution in the law. However, even though that will continue to evolve, kind of more guidance will come out. There will be, other legal questions raised, other situations that lead to, other court decisions. The important thing always is for school district leaders to consult first and foremost with your administrators at the school level, going up to the district level and your superintendent and your local school board counsel, the attorney for your local school board. Always consult with those folks if something should come up in your school district, whether it's an allegation that there has been some sort of illegal discrimination or harassment on the basis of a student's identity as lesbian, gay, their sexual orientation, if they identify in some way as a transgendered student. First and foremost, it's so important to respond and not react. And by that, I mean the initial immediate reaction usually is going to be something that is not fully informed by what the law says, what the situation is, what everyone feels about it, what the student feels, what their parents or guardians and family feel about something. Here at KSBA, I'm not speaking for them, but I will tell you, very frequently we will get questions from a superintendent, from a school board attorney, from school board members, where we'll get a phone call here at the office one day and they'll say, well, I need your advice on this legal issue. We've had a student who said that this happened, or a student came in and said that they have now told us they are transgender and they want to do this or that, whether it's bathrooms, locker rooms, play on a sports team, whatever it is. We'll get a question that basically says, what do we have to do? Do we need to sort of go in and do some renovation project on a bathroom? Do we have to do this or that? It is always so important to respond and not react. What that means is don't immediately in that first discussion sort of start having a discussion with the student on here's what we will do or not do, or here's what the law requires us to do or not do. Simply say, we need to have some discussion about this. Always listen first. Always say, I need to go back and I need to look into this and research and get some legal advice on what the law says and what the new guidance is. Always, always, always the right course of action to say, I need to respond after I've been informed, after I've asked for some guidance. That is always our first response when those questions come in. But always remember what it's really about. stay calm. Sometimes, unfortunately, things like this can get heated very quickly, whether it's between school employees and the family of a student or the student themselves. Always important simply to just breathe and remember what the mission is. It all goes back, as I said at the beginning, remembering that we have students like this in all of our classrooms, and the mission that we all share is educating them, each and every child, no matter what their circumstances are, whether it's poverty, different family situations, where they come from, whether they have special educational needs or not. Just always fall back and remember that mission and ground your response in that way. No matter what the student's sort of individual situation is always the right course of action. I will say, though, in speaking of that U.S. Supreme Court decision in Bostock, like I said, the federal government was interpreting it that way largely anyway. From bathrooms to sports, the general lay of the land at this moment is for inclusion. I think no one can predict what might change next. No one can predict what another court might say in some slightly different lawsuit next year. But very generally, I can tell you that the move of most courts and the move of the legal developments generally is for more inclusion, but it is evolving. So of course, first, as I said, consult with your administrators and your school board counsel. Rethink situations. Here's some kind of good advice. Rethink the situations where you divide students by gender at all, and kind of what purpose that you do that. Kind of what is the reason that you divide students by gender at all, and rethink, well, what does that look like? Do we need to do that or not? Kind of what is the reasoning behind that? Recently, I spoke to a school board member here in Kentucky that, without naming them or the district at all, they called us for a kind of a quick legal advice and said, we are very soon going to be looking at a major school construction project. For the first time in decades, literally, for the first time in anyone's personal experience on the school board there in that district, they are looking to completely design from scratch and build an all new school. And so kind of this came up in those early discussions, and the board member called and said, well, what is the situation currently with the federal law on bathrooms? Should we design this building that is going to be all new and that we will need to be around for 50 or 60 years or more into the future? Hard to predict what things will be, but should we design bathrooms and locker rooms this way or that way or in some certain way? Kind of, we don't want to design it now and build it and go to all of this work and expense, and then 5 years down the road, something has changed legally and we have to do something a different way. So first of all, I said, great for you at that local district level to be having those forward-thinking discussions in your planning. And to plan for the future, that long in the future, we can't predict exactly, but I can tell you that generally it will seem to be moving in the direction of more inclusivity. So I said, very likely that you should be prudent and plan for kind of maximum privacy for everyone. Always stop and think, is what we're doing meeting the needs of everyone, no matter what their needs might be, that we may not even be aware of? So I said, probably a good idea to design a building from the bathrooms and the locker rooms and everything else, sort of for maximum privacy for each and individual student, no matter their gender, no matter their kind of open or not open sexual identity. And I said, frankly, that's the way that a lot of the rest of the world is moving as well at the adult level. I said a lot of college dorms, a lot of gyms for adults, gym facilities and YMCAs. When you go to an old one versus one that's just been constructed in the last few years, you will notice that even outside of K-12 and some of the school laws that we are talking about, there is a general move in society sort of for designing buildings for greater access to everyone and greater privacy for everyone. And so that's kind of one example of something that is slightly evolving in the law that is important for all of us to keep in mind when we try to plan for the future. But also, as I said, some things are not at all new. Out of the 5 big areas of the legal issues that I wanted to touch on, one of them was our state code of ethics for Kentucky's school certified personnel. We usually just call this the teacher code of ethics. Our state EPSB, which is mostly made up of teachers, Kentucky teachers, kind of on that board, they created this code of ethics. It is specific to Kentucky, created by mostly Kentucky teachers, and it's been around for several years. From the beginning of our webinar today, I said it's always important when something feels new and different and changing to realize how much of it actually is not new. When you read through, I pulled it out in front of me, when you read through that code of ethics for Kentucky educators, some of what is there is timeless, and also applies to LGBTQ students that we all have in our classrooms everywhere, as well as all students, each and every child, no matter what their unique needs are. It says that every individual certified educator in Kentucky Public Schools shall believe in the worth and dignity of each human being, shall strive to uphold the following obligations to all students. You shall take reasonable measures to protect the health, safety, and emotional well-being of students. You shall refrain from subjecting students to embarrassment or disparagement. Your obligation to all parents is to endeavor to understand community cultures and diverse home environments of students. There again, today, only when we're focused on this topic, you might read that and think only through the lens of students with 2 dads or 2 moms. But that is talking about diverse home environments. That's talking about students with an interracial home, students with just one grandmother raising them, or one single mom or dad. You shall distinguish between personal views and the views of the employing educational agency. Remember that we all wear different hats and we play different roles. There again, a group of Kentucky teachers on the EPSB created a Kentucky Code of Ethics for Kentucky teachers years ago and already said it is absolutely important ethically for each teacher to distinguish between their personal views and feelings about any given situation and their professional educator role to each and every one of our students. There again, that is completely timeless and covers so much of what we might talk about when instead we jump to conclusions, we jump all the way into the weeds of something like, well, I do or do not feel a certain way about students using this room or that room. Always important, as I said, respond and don't react. Don't jump all the way into the detail of a situation. Instead, calmly inform yourself, be mindful of everyone, and step back to some of these things that are not at all new, like the Code of Ethics and how it applies to everyone. The third big area that I wanted to focus on that we usually specifically comes up when we're talking about the needs of LGBTQ students is bullying. There are lots of resources unique to Kentucky on the website of our Kentucky Center for School Safety. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Center for School Safety. That was created, I believe, in 1998. It has been around in Kentucky, a board of directors of all Kentuckians, about half of which are Kentucky educators and education stakeholders. They do great work. And when you go to their website, they have an entire area devoted to stopping and preventing and responding to bullying, no matter what the bullying situation may be, no matter what the underlying situation is between 2 or more students in any of our classrooms. And a big part of what their information focuses on is preventing bullying also of LGBTQIA students that identify in any one of these ways, whether it's they openly identify that way and might be bullied or harassed by other students because of it, or whether or not they don't openly identify and they're just perceived by other students in this way. It is so critically important, back to just that code of ethics, that every one of us in our public schools is looking out and protecting each and every one of our students from bullying by any other students for any reason, especially including this reason. I say especially including this reason, not only because we're talking about it today, and not only because I'm a gay person who grew up in our public schools, but also because studies in Kentucky and nationally and even global research studies consistently show that students who identify openly or confidentially in any of these groups of students as LGBTQ, they consistently face more bullying than students who do not identify in any of these groups. They consistently have a higher level of suicide ideation or attempted suicide acts. Because that is so universally acknowledged at this point and so consistent in so many studies, I think that's why it uniquely comes up in this discussion for us today as something that every Kentucky educator, everyone in and around our schools needs to be mindful of. So again, another resource beyond just our local Center for School Safety in Kentucky is at the federal level. The U.S. Department of Education has a website devoted to bullying called stopbullying.gov. It has tons of great information there, resources for educators and school leaders to be mindful and aware of preventing bullying of any of our students. This also comes up in the law at our state level and the local school board level. There are statutes and local board policies about bullying, responding to bullying, and preventing bullying that everyone should be aware of as well. There again, the key thing is always to respond and not react, and to be mindful and kind of on the lookout for any possible bullying that might be there, not only for our LGBTQ students, putting any personal views that anyone may have aside, but really for all students. There again, even now with our with some levels of greater acceptance kind of at a national public level of people of any age that are LGBTQ, still, of course, we would be foolish and naive if we didn't just openly acknowledge that a lot of people have personal views about this. Even a lot of people in our schools may have personal views, even about their students who might identify in any of these ways. Of course, we know that, which is why it's so important to not jump in the weeds on this, but to step back and realize that bullying by any students of any other students for any reason is something that we need to all work together, not only morally and ethically, but by law to be on the lookout for and to prevent and respond to. The fourth of my 5 big areas I wanted to touch on that gets a lot of discussion on this topic with these students recently is the use of pronouns, especially with students who identify as transgender. So of course, I'm sure some of you may see it's becoming more common for a lot of folks to include with their name, even professionally, even when they sign an email or a letter, to include their preferred pronouns. This is something also that there's a lot of guidance about. Our state Department of Education, the school counseling area of our state Department of Ed has put together a short guidance document that's available on their website of sort of guidance on how educators can respond when a student asks to be referred to by a certain one name or another, or a certain different set of pronouns that might not match their gender or their sex assigned at birth. That is, of course, we all acknowledge a new topic getting discussion. That underlying issue is not necessarily new. We know that that is something that invokes a lot of responses from a lot of people. A lot of people kind of feel that that's something that educators shouldn't do. So it's so important to always, again, when that happens, when that comes up, which it probably will for many of us eventually across Kentucky, when a student comes to you and says that, when a family, their parents, their guardians might come to the school to discuss that. It is always appropriate to say, I need to look into this more. I need to respond and not react. I need to go back and talk to my school administrator, maybe even at the district level, maybe even school board council. Look at the guidance, some of the guidance that has come out, items for consideration on what your response can or should be from the Department of Ed. 9 times out of 10, just listening and having a conversation with the student or students and family directly involved is what will resolve that. But it's always important to know that that guidance is there when this comes up, to not feel taken by surprise and off guard, to know that there are some resources there at the state level to help school leaders and individual teachers respond to that. As I said, when you look at that guidance, it's important to always know that that document from the Department of Ed is not law. It is considerations. And within that guidance, they very frequently say, discuss this with school leaders, even school board council, especially on issues that might come up where a student may come, and this is covered in their guidance from the Department of Ed, when an individual student might come to their teacher and say, well, I identify with this other gender. I want you to start calling me by a different name. I want you to start referring to me by different pronouns. Maybe not only just in class, maybe on school records. I want you to change my name on the school records on the roll. When things like that come up, sometimes the family may already be aware of it. The parents might come with the student and make that request. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the student says, I want you to call me by a different name, and I do not want you to tell my parents about it. I don't want you to tell them anything about this. I don't want them to know for some reason. There's a lot of information in the guidance about what a response can and should be when that happens, if that ever happens. That is that area of law is kind of unsettled. It is always important for you at the school level to, as I said, have some discussions about that, review the law. That guidance document does not have the force of law. There are some overlapping areas of protecting a student's well-being that is in the Code of Ethics, certainly protecting students from any possible harassment or abuse, even if it's at home. Responding and reporting, as of course, every Kentucky educator, every employee of every school district is a mandated reporter for any possible or suspected child abuse that might happen at home. But also the overlapping area of the rights and the interest that parents and guardians do have over not only directing educational issues, but directing other issues like this. There are federal and state education records laws that are on the books that weigh in on these kinds of things. So that's one area that I did want to touch on today before I leave you, on the issue of pronouns and names to be mindful of. That there is some guidance to help you work through this, but also to really have a careful discussion if that specific request is made of call me by a different name, but don't tell my parents. That area of the law has some overlapping aspects to it that need a lot of careful discussion locally before you just jump to one conclusion or another. The fifth kind of big legal topic I wanted to touch on, and then we're going to, I think, come towards the end of our time together, is that I think we should think in terms of protecting all kids just in case of any unique issue that we may or may not know of. One of the guidance documents that I've referred to from the U.S. Department of Ed, just as one kind of possible suggestion, says, earlier I said, think in terms of, now that we're having more public discussions about transgendered students, think in terms of any time that you divide students by gender now and whether or not you really need to or why you do that. And if you've always done that and there's no real reason to do that, maybe just not divide them that way any longer. Maybe even things like, instead of saying to the classroom of students, okay, you guys, let's do this or do that, just say, okay, you all, which many of us in Kentucky probably say y'all anyway. That's just one little suggestion in a list of suggestions. I mean, there's no legal requirement that everyone does that. But that's just one way of thinking about this in a different way. That from the very beginning of our webinar, I said, just be aware and mindful that you have these students right now in your classrooms and always have, whether they're open about it or not, whether they've really come to terms with it yet themselves or not, or whether or not you realize it. They are there, and we need to be mindful of sort of the just in case approach. Whatever we are doing, from the classroom right on up to the local school district in the state, think, well, just in case one of these students in this room is LGBTQ. Whatever I'm about to do or say or not do or not say, how would this serve them or meet their needs? Does the curriculum I have, does the lesson plan that I'm putting together, does the procedure I'm about to follow, is this open to everyone? Is there any way that this could in any way exclude anyone? That kind of just in case approach will solve so many of the issues that we do see come up, not only in Kentucky Public Schools, but elsewhere. And one other little personal anecdote that I've often used ever since I first came across it to guide a lot of the thinking I do, just not only as an individual person, but in also my professional work in education. Years ago, I was reading a book, has nothing to do with LGBTQ issues at all. I was reading this book by a comedian named Amy Sedaris. And it was she is a comedian. It was this funny book. And in part of it, she was talking about when she meets new people, making small talk with people, at a party that she's just met. She said that at one point, she asked someone kind of making small talk. She said, well, what do you do for a living? And the person said, oh, well, I actually just lost my job recently and I'm unemployed. And she talked about how she felt like she put her foot in her mouth, but that taught her that for the rest of her life, that's one question that might be this common question for many of us. But she said, from now on, I will never ask someone what they do for a living, just in case maybe they just lost their job. Maybe that's this huge aspect of household strife and trauma for them. And that will bring it right to the forefront and kind of put them on edge or embarrass them or put them in a tight spot when I'm just trying to make small talk. That has stuck with me personally. I never ask anybody I don't know what they do for a living since I read that. And that is one way to, again, step out of the weeds on this discussion today when we're talking about equity for LGBTQ students and what that looks like. Stepping out of that all the way back to, like I said at the beginning, so much of this is just awareness and a sense of mindfulness for just in case one of the students in this classroom is identifying in one of these groups or not, whether they're struggling with it or not, whether they're open about it or not. I don't know what all of their needs are. I don't know what they have happening at home or for any reason, this or anything else. So just in case, I'm going to be mindful for everything I say and every lesson I put together. I'm going to be more mindful to serve the needs of everyone, including LGBTQ students. That is really at the heart of everything we do. And as I said repeatedly throughout this webinar, that is not new or different or special for LGBTQ students. It is not that, a federal court has just suddenly come into Kentucky and said, well, you have to start doing something a certain way. That is just a bedrock fundamental principle for everything we do for all students in education, always has been, and really, in many ways, this is no different. We might be talking about it a little bit more intentionally and explicitly on things like this that are very important to have. But at the same time, so much of what we do in equity is really the same across the board. It's just being mindful and being aware of who all of our students are and working to provide our services to them and educate them and care for them and support them no matter what. So that has me, we've got about 10 minutes before the end of an hour. That's all I'll have. I don't know if any questions may or may not have come in or if there's any questions that Andy may have, but I'll just turn it back.
Great job, Eric. I think you have definitely touched on a number of topics that are powerful for our children. And I think that's what we have to look at. I do have a comment here. It says, could you chat about how to handle a situation where there is a disagreement between the parent and the student related to this issue? How do we as schools and educators balance these opposing sides? I, for one, had that same situation where a child was transgender, but dad wanted one thing, mother wanted another. And so any advice on a situation like that?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. And I think you're exactly right that this could come up in a lot of different ways. You could have a student that comes to the teacher and says, I'm transgender. I want you to start referring to me by a different pronoun, by a different name. And I haven't told either of my parents. Let's assume it's two parents are in a household. They might say, well, I haven't told my parents. I don't think that they will support that. I don't want them to know, so I don't want you to tell them. That could be one situation that might come up. You could have a situation like you said, Andy, where it's the parents are divorced and there's sort of shared custody and shared decision-making about education issues. And both of the child has told both of their parents that that's where a disagreement comes in. And one parent is very in agreement and supportive and says, yes, refer to them from now on by this other name and pronoun. The other parent says, I'm the opposite. Do not do that. I don't support that at all. That's a big part of why, as I said earlier, there is frankly no one easy answer to answer this question of how do I handle that situation? It will always be different based on the situation. There could be legal issues involved. In the situation of a two-parent house or two divorced parents, there could be a lot of issues with whatever the custody arrangement is. One parent could somehow have all of the educational decision-making powers or not. And that is something that will definitely be above and beyond that individual classroom teacher to discuss with the parents and frankly, even know about what that kind of situation is, which is why above all, how to handle that situation would be to, as I said, respond, don't react. Say, okay, tell the student, I need to kind of look into this for right now. I won't say anything right now until I've had a chance to talk to the administrator, talk even to the district administrators, pull the KDE guidance, talk to your board council, and have a bigger discussion of, what will our response be? Should we talk to one or both parents or not? There's a lot of different ways that you could handle that situation. There is no one way to do it at all. The only one way to handle it is to say, frankly, I need to take this back and look into this, but then to do that. It's very important to actually then circle back and after you've looked into it, to continue addressing the situation, whatever the best way for you locally is for that student, and not just to kind of say, this is above and beyond me. I'm not going to do that and look into that, or never circle back with that student in whatever way works out best given the circumstance. So that's probably the best answer that there can be for that question. Is the only one way to handle it is to take the time to have a good response and to look into it fully.
Thank you, Eric. I do truly feel that the focus should be always on the child. And you brought up a great point, respond. You don't have to react. Sometimes we do a knee-jerk reaction. These conversations are going to continue to expand, I think, in our schools. I think as administrators, teachers, we need to become more well-versed in how to respond to these type of situations, not necessarily how to react. And a lot of times that child may be sitting in your classroom, you may not even be aware of it. And sometimes we can say things that can make that child very uncomfortable. So I do think that this is a conversation that we can move forward on. I do have a question here about, can you repeat the 5 topics that you have mentioned that were key to your discussion today?
Certainly. And just something that you just said too, Andy, it's not even, we're talking about equity for these students. It's not even necessarily that a student is LGBTQ. Maybe one or both of their parents are. Someone in their household is, or our colleagues. I mean, frankly, one of my high school teachers, after I had them in high school years later, sort of came out and identified as a member of one of these groups. And so it's also, for the people watching this, it's our colleagues, it's our peers, as well as our students and other people in the lives of our students. To answer the question, what was kind of the 5 big legal topics? The first was Title IX and the recent Bostock Supreme Court opinion that interpreted Title IX to apply to sexual orientation and gender identity. So all of the guidance about the Bostock case and how state and federal agencies will interpret and implement Title IX because of that was one. And there's a lot of information on the U.S. Department of Ed OCR, the Office of Civil Rights website, about the Bostock case. That is BOSTOCK, Bostock. The second was the Teacher Code of Ethics from EPSB and how timeless a lot of that is, and looking at that code of ethics through the lens of students who are LGBTQ. The third frequent topic that comes up is just generally bullying, and how bullying is an issue for all students, but it is sort of an especially heightened issue for these students. And we know that from the consistent research that backs that up. And again, I said our Center for School Safety website, as well as the U.S. Department of Ed's website, stopbullying.gov, that have a lot of specific resources on ways that any teacher in any public school in America can respond and help prevent and respond to bullying. The fourth big legal issue that a lot of folks jump to currently is the issue of pronouns. That kind of, in some ways, is new, seems new. It's been getting a lot of new recent conversation. So I talked about the guidance about that specific piece of this, sort of pronouns for students who identify as transgender. And that was that considerations document from our State Department of Ed that you can find on the KDE website. And also talked a lot about, when you read that carefully, which you should, if and when this comes up for any of you, to also be mindful that that itself is just considerations. That issue is complex, and that one document is not the one legal answer, the one state of the law on how to address that situation locally. And the 5 kind of concept I wanted to leave with was just that the just in case kind of mindset, sort of thinking, frankly, a lot of people that are watching this today or will watch this recording, you might not have yet had a student in class that identified this way openly to you. None of these things that we're talking about may have come up directly for someone watching this training. However, as I said, being aware and mindful that all the way back to the beginning of the webinar where I said 12-year-old Eric Kennedy in Paducah, Kentucky, back in 1995, me of all people who said, wait, gay people isn't new? They had gay people hundreds of years ago? And my mom that said, well, yeah, there's been gay people as long as there have been people. Thinking of that awareness and that just in case a student in this classroom has a parent that just recently came out and identified to the family that they are any of these identifications, LGBTQ, whether or not one of these students is struggling with it, questioning kind of whether or not they are, has come to terms with it themselves, but hasn't openly said anything to friends or family or teachers. The just in case that any of those students in your classroom is one of these students that we are talking about, being mindful of that in every decision that an educator makes and all of the work that all of us do, sort of for meeting the needs and providing equity and education to all of our students, being mindful that just in case one of them is LGBTQ and I just don't know it, how would that change whatever I'm doing? You know, like my friend in law school that said, well, you're the first gay person I've known. And I said, I promise you that is not true. I'm the first one that you're just sort of openly acknowledged and aware of. Think of all of the things that that friend of mine, that college law school classmate, may or may not have said or done over the years to friends, students in their classrooms, relatives, or anyone that maybe was LGBTQ and just didn't openly talk about it with her. Always being mindful, and that goes again, that's timeless for all groups of people in all things and all backgrounds, not just this.
Eric, thank you. On behalf of KEDC, this has been powerful. I think at the end of the day, we are doing the work to support our children. These are the type of conversations we need to be having. And if we get any more questions, I'll be sure to forward those and we can share it with our people who are participating. But again, Eric, thank you so much. You did a great job. Thank you.
Listen, thank you. Everyone that watches this now or later, thank you for everything you all are doing. It is such an extremely difficult time in public education in Kentucky and everywhere with the pandemic and everything else. So just the work is happening out in our districts and classrooms. Thank you all for what you do, and thank KEDC for having this entire series of webinars.
All right, thank you.